Okay.
Hello there, Robert.
Hello. I'm getting a thing that's going to pop up here and say that it's not working, and then it'll go away after I click the X.
It says we're live,
Well,
Robert. It
what's that?
says we're live.
Oh, it says we're live?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, my. Well, thank you for joining us here at the Anarchist Experience, and my name is Robert. I'm your host, and have a special guest here with us today. It's Jeffrey Tucker. Thank you very much for joining me today, Mr. Tucker. Given the sudden impromptu nature of the request, I certainly do appreciate you
Oh,
coming out.
sure. Listen, I was just working on an article that I think might be interesting to discuss because I just started it.
Mhm.
I mean, I'm welcome to discuss it if you want, but I'm just thinking about this topic, and it concerns all these revolts around the country, and they really are all over the country against the police and the abuse of the police powers, you know.
Mhm.
And I kind of began to think about this, like. The normal view of this is that it's racially based protest, you know, racial minorities upset about the police, and particularly blacks, and that's the character of the protest. But I'm wondering if actually we're all being kind of manipulated by these characterizations of the revolts, because since 2009 we're now in the third wave of massive public street protests against something. I mean, it began with the Tea Party in 2009, and then it moved to the Occupy Wall Street movement in 2011, and now here we are with the anti-police protests of 2014. This is the third great wave, and I'm wondering, like, maybe this is part of a bigger picture. You know, maybe that it's not right-wing, left-wing, racial, but it's all kind of different cultural expressions of the same protest, a protest against overweening power in whatever form. So that's the thesis of my article, and I thought I would just throw that out there. Um,
Okay.
yeah, it's kind of interesting, I think.
Well, certainly, we live in a world where there is a very large amount of frustration with people who are not able to achieve the goals that they have for themselves and for their lives, for their families. Um, and it's entirely possible that there are groups that like their positions of power that are using various machinations to kind of divert the attention away from themselves that would rightly get them in trouble for doing what they're doing, and instead focus that attention on other groups, and create these hostilities that avoid the actual problem. I would say that it certainly makes sense to me.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, it's a fascinating thing, and you know you have to ask yourself. I was kind of thinking about that, like maybe we're all thinking about this in two incremental units. You know, sometimes like history goes forward in these kind of slices of time, and we're all kind of buried in the daily news. But if you back up a little bit and do kind of like a 5-year sweep, what we actually see is really a gigantic movement of popular protests against government power in one form or another, whatever form it takes. So the Tea Party is mostly a white bourgeois movement that was protesting taxes and Obamacare and TARP in particular. And then the Occupy Wall Street movement was really about the bailouts and the transfer of the favoritism showed to corporate America and to Wall Street, the sense that Washington and Wall Street were all in a conspiracy, and now you have this revolts against local police and their very scary militarization and abuse and murders really, but really it's kind of when you put it all together, it's an amazing sort of growing wave of public outrage against power in general. And I've been thinking about, like, why did this begin? Where did it come from? And really, it must trace, at least in my own mind, to the response to 9/11, right? So 9/11 happened. We had this gigantic change in regime. I mean, it was kind of lying in waiting, but basically, the U.S. became under a form of martial law, and constitutional liberties were thrown out and everything. That worked for a while until the financial bust, 2008. So then you have the combination of like growing poverty and lack of economic opportunity and unemployment and sort of sinking American incomes, with this overweening and sort of almost foreign feeling of imposition of abuse and coercion from the top down, and it just kind of has been the slow release of explosive energy among the U.S. population to just say, down with the system. I think it's really interesting to consider that maybe there's something significant going on here.
Well, there's definitely been a lot of change that has occurred, but given that we are in a a society that has had a lot of response from anti-war protests and so on, that's certainly the case. But I think that more so the backlash is due to the economic trials and tribulations that we've gone through as a result of the bailouts with the banks, the bailouts with the automotive industry, the incredible, infusion of monies going into various different companies to prop them up, whether it be Solyndra or whether it be your favorite farmer who doesn't grow crops or whatever it happens to be. So I think that there's a lot more backlash as a result of the economic stuff than the militaristic police state thing.
Yeah, that could be. I was looking at some data the other day, and I sometimes forget to think about this, but go over to the St. Louis Fed and look up real median household income trends for the last half century, and see that today we are exactly where we were in 1995. Basically, we've lost 20 years of time in terms of improvement of the standard of living. All told. I mean, there's disparities within that, but the statistics, and these are fairly reliable, right? Like income statistics are, unlike GDP or other things, are actually reliable statistics. You've got 20 years of lost increases in prosperity. That has to have some kind of gigantic political implications. I mean, you look at that chart, it's just like, holy criminy, And then when you consider that this has happened during the time of amazing digital technological revolution, like huge improvements in technology should actually usher in unprecedented prosperity. We saw that in the 19th century. We saw it in the Industrial Revolution. We're not seeing that now in the 21st century.
Absolutely. One of the things I think that is potentially causing some of this drag that we're experiencing is that we're bringing in a very large sector of a workforce that was normally not available to the economic reality that we have in the worldwide economy that exists, where the workers that are available in China and various other countries that have opened their borders to having development, well, they're putting in certain restrictions and certain limitations upon the opportunity for other businesses to come in and increase the competition for that labor, and those laborers are also prohibited from being able to involve themselves as directly as they would in the market. And so, unlike the era where we had a huge influx of people into the United States from various different countries around the world, where we saw people who were able to actually jump on into various different occupations, whether it be driving vehicles, offering, opening bars, all the different things that you saw. Let's say, for example, the Irish community, you would see a lot of bars opening up and you would see from other different communities where they would specialize in their various different fields, where you kind of started to get these, expectations that if you are a bar owner, then you've got to be Irish, and if you are a taxi driver, you have to be Pakistani or something like that. These realistically, fake, they're obviously, fake generalizations, but, since you had such a large influx of those particular people from those communities, they were able to, pursue these avenues in careers that maybe they might be typecasted, but whatever, they still had opportunities. They jumped into them. They were able to be part of the economy and create new opportunities for themselves and actually, manipulate their situation and become successful. Well, we've got kind of like a almost like a slave labor type of environment that's occurring because of the way that the restrictions of people's opportunities in China, for example, are being done. And that may cause a significant drag on the opportunities for people to ask for higher wages in labor, for example.
I mean, there's no question. I mean, people hardly ever talk about this, but the regulatory state is outrageous. You know what it's done to labor markets. Uh, I mean, just anecdotally, I know so many people who just feel sort of like massively trapped in their jobs. You know, it's like there's no longer a choice of profession. Like if you have a job, people just cling to it for dear life, no matter how miserable it makes you. I mean, labor markets are just not as fluid as they would be in a free market. It doesn't actually make sense. It's deeply dangerous. Job lock is a major problem that hardly anybody really talks about, and it's got to be an enormous source of public frustration too. And of course, Obamacare just makes this whole thing worse, right? I mean, my whole impression of Obamacare is that it's been like generally public political culture underestimates what a calamity it really was for average people. I know so many people that are just like feel gravely ripped off, and everything's worse now than it was, 2 years ago. But there's very little public admission of this, so that's got to be another factor.
Absolutely. Well, the intervention is just, it's nonstop. There's always somebody willing to, line the pockets of a politician in order to get some sort of perk or benefit, and make a restriction on their competition so that they can continue to charge inflated prices. Well, I want to have you go ahead and kind of explain where your article is going to be published, so that.
Oh yeah. So yeah, I'm just working on it now, and it's called. I think I called it something like "We Are All Part of the Same Revolt" or something like that. Mm-hmm. And it's a kind of interesting thing for me. I'll put it up at Liberty Me probably by the end of the evening. Liberty.me. My own site is tucker.liberty.me. It's called Beautiful Anarchy. But for me, it's like I had very mixed feelings about both the Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street, right? Because and there's reason to have mixed feelings about the recent police protests too. I mean, there's a reason why libertarians should be both like happy about these things and then a little bit skeptical, because like the Tea Party movement began as a revolt against TARP and taxes and Obamacare, but then you'd actually go, as the movement matured, it became sort of nationalist and nativist and sort of Americanist, like bourgeois conservatism over time. Like you would go to their rallies and there'd be some guy be rallying, railing against immigration, or against abortion rights or whatever. And so it had a right wing feel, Yeah. But you look at like what the thing that gave it energy at the outset was good. The thing that it like ultimately concretely embodied as a political agenda was not so good. There's the same thing with Occupy Wall Street. Like it began as a kind of a protest against crony capitalism, bailouts, and the cozy relationship between Wall Street and Washington. The fact that these Goldman Sachs getting I mean, all the troubled assets, were easily bought and consumed by the Fed, and the capitalist class was protected against the errors of its ways. Its losses were socialized, its profits were privatized. But then, as Occupy went on, it became ever more sort of socialist. It was like, let's loot the rich, the 1% of the problem. Let's take away all their money so we can have it for ourselves. And it became like a tedious left-wing movement that actually scared the hell out of me. But and it's the same thing with the anti-police protests. Like they began as legitimate complaints against the militarization of the police, and then I think as time will go on, we're going to see ever more calls for racial justice, which I favor racial justice, but a lot of times this does not mean freedom. It means like transfer payments, and favoritism and that sort of thing. The old racial agenda that we know too well. So I need, like each case, there's reasons for libertarians to be both celebrate the the motive force behind them, and then be skeptical about the final result. Like in each of these cases. So, but I think what's interesting to think about is really the sort of trajectory behind them. I mean, they all ultimately and finally represent protests against power. So, like for me, I've been really skeptical of the Tea Party movement. Thinking about it in that way makes me a little more friendly towards it, and same thing with Occupy Wall Street. I was like, these people hate capitalism, how can I like this crap? But thinking about it as a general revolt against power, makes me more praiseworthy. I've been actually very favorable towards the anti-police protests because, I mean, quite frankly, I'm like personally, I was an early adopter of radical anti-police attitudes. I've been anti-police for like 20 years. Like, this is just the most direct way in which the state tries to control us. And of course, since 2008, the police have become nothing other than a tax collection force for local governments and a political machinery for imposing, sort of the national militarized agenda. And they've been absolutely terrifying. So all I'm saying is that there's reasons for us as lovers of liberty to find merit in all of these cultural expressions of protest. And that's what my article is really about. I'm going to try to make this argument that these are, in some sense, all part of the same movement and highly significant in that way. I can't.
Okay.
Yeah, there you go.
All right. Yeah. Sorry about that. So, well, if anybody wants to take a look at it, please go to tucker.liberty.me and check it out. And being that the Anarchist Experience is a show that basically what we do is we debate things, we discuss things,
Cool.
and in an as open and honest of environment, so that we don't have the ranting and screaming at each other. No hostility there, but I'm going to have to put your foot to the flame, so to speak, and kind of ask some questions that are going to be difficult on you. So,
I got that.
All right. So a friend of mine, his name is Brent Langle, and he asks, or he's asked me to tell you, I don't think that you're a real anarchist. And so this is something that we get as ANCAPs all the time, is the claim from anarcho-communists or anarchists that just call themselves anarchists, that if you believe in capitalism, then you believe in the state. Mm-hmm. And what would be your response to that particular claim?
Well, I guess my first response is, let's change the name. I have no wedded attachment to the word capitalism as such. I think of capitalism as the stuff that people do when they're left alone. Okay, not everybody thinks of it that way. I may have very good friends like Sheldon Richman, Corey Massimino, Gary Chartier, Charles Johnson, the left libertarians, who think that capitalism has always been bound up with the state for centuries, and it's not possible to think of one without the other. To me, that's a debate about intellectual and economic history. I don't really want to get into that. I think they have merits to their case. If somebody doesn't like the term capitalism, I'm fine with that. I don't have to use it. But let's not, there's two things that I would like to emphasize. Private property is just part of the structure of the world. Without it, we don't have liberty. That's one thing. Okay. And the second thing is that accumulation of capital is essential to prosperity. So if we don't allow the accumulation of capital, we're not going to have complex production structures and not be able to feed the world.
Okay. Well, I guess the response that you would probably get would be something along the lines of, well, number one, we had the enclosure movements, and we had the the westward bound taking over of land by the capitalists of the Europeans in America, stealing land from people who had essentially homesteaded it as their ranches. They were free range livestock ranches, and in these particular cases, this is an example of what capitalism does, where in England, the enclosure movement being actions being that well, these are your parcels of land and you now own them, and congratulations, you're going to be wealthy, and anybody who works on your land is going to be subservient to you for the rest of time. Similarly, with the taking over of land and making it into basically claiming dibs over certain parcels of land and then being able to charge prices for the purchase of this land, or even just only renting out the land for people, then makes people able to profit off of the labors of other people and not their own. Now,
Yeah,
obviously,
yeah. I think there's great crimes in history, and the enclosure movement was one of them. I don't like the way the westward expansion took place. Look, I don't even believe in the Louisiana Purchase, so I don't like colonialism. There's terrible things that have happened in human history, but that none of which discredits the reality of private property, which far predates the enclosure movement. I mean, private property came to the world probably something like 130,000 years ago, as far as anthropologists can tell, and it came about because the commons didn't work to produce enough for humanity to be fed. So people had to figure out a way to domesticate animals and protect a land so that they could grow stuff and actually become productive and feed themselves. That's the origin of private property, not the enclosure movement.
but wouldn't the response be then actually in those particular time frames, these ownerships were actually communal. They weren't private property ownership.
No, that's not true. I mean, there is such a thing as the commons. We know this.
Right.
And there are some things that can be in the part of the commons. But ultimately, something like domestication of animals, you can't have a small herd of sheep designed to produce wool, milk, and breed other sheep so you can accumulate certain capital and feed yourself. You can't have that owned in the commons because there's the tragedy of the commons. That takes place. I mean, a sheep is either owned by you or somebody else, and if you try to have that as part of the commons, you're gonna have to tear it in half and kill it, or you're gonna have to kill each other. The whole purpose of private property is to stop conflict. It's to allocate resource titles in a way that allows for peaceful exchange. And that's what gives rise to civilization. You cannot forever have things owned in the commons. There's some things that are possible to have in the commons through mutual agreement of a community. That's fine, if it works out that way. But private property, I mean, and we know this, definitely had a specific. It's a technology that humankind invented to deal with the problem of scarcity.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily it was about scarcity. I would say it was more about rivalrousness.
Well, I think that, it depends on how you want to use the term. I agree with it. I mean, that's fine. You want to use the term opposite. Basically, the problem is when you have non-reproducible resources where they cannot be controlled by the whole community. That when one person controls something, somebody else cannot. That's the origin of private. By the way, Mises thinks that private property. In the first third of Socialism, he writes, people would be very interested to read this. He thinks that private property ultimately rests in a type of violence. And that sounds like a shocking claim, but I more or less agree with him. So you imagine yourself, as a early humanoid or whatever in 130,000 years ago, and you've decided that there aren't enough berries and slow-moving turtles in the world to feed yourself. And so you have to create a pen outside your home to domesticate animals and grow food. How are you going to establish the fact that that is yours and keep other people off of it? I mean, the only possible way that you can really do that is to develop either a social consensus, which is sometimes
really hard to do.
Yeah, but basically you have to keep people off your goddamn land. I mean, you have to be prepared to use violence against people who are trying to take what you regard as yours. So that's because there is no great judge that emerges from a cloud, as John Locke might imagine, and say, "You have mixed your labor with that land. Now it is yours." Okay, that doesn't actually happen. Basically, you've got to defend what's yours.
Right.
And so in that sense, Mises says that there's always a threat of violence behind all private ownership. And in that sense, I'm prepared to agree with him. And he's willing to concede that, actually. It's a really riveting passage, actually. And there's something else interesting, Robert. Let me just plug in my computer again and I'll mention this. I mean, when did private property become a social consensus? Really, it comes about uh, very much at the same time of the birth of modernity itself. Like, if you were a typical medieval peasant in, say, the 11th century, living in somewhere in Italy or France or Spain, and you successfully have figured out how to defend your homestead and the stuff within your homestead, and maybe you've got a small plot of land and you've hired some protectors out there, shepherds to guard your sheep or whatever the thing may be. All of that is cool, and you're more or less living a peaceful life. There's still a lot of threats of violence and a lot of shit going down all the time, but mostly you have something approaching private property rights. But the second you throw your stuff on your back and head out to go on some sort of travel outside your homestead, outside your local community, and hit the road, the one thing you can be certain of is that you will certainly be robbed. You might be killed, but regardless, you're not going to be safe, because there was no recognition of private property rights outside of this small realm that you controlled. I mean, it took centuries for people to develop the ability to travel without being looted and mugged and killed. So there was no private property rights in a broader sense. And even now, I mean, there are plenty of places you can go where there is no recognition of private property rights, and then government doesn't recognize our private property rights in any case. So I think that's a very interesting way to look at it. I don't see private property as being, an embedded part of the natural world. I see it as a technology that humankind invented to deal with a very specific problem.
Well, I mean, if you do think about other creatures in the gamut of nature, we have a variety of different species that do create private property. In essence, they claim for, I don't know, there are some birds that will bury nuts for future harvest, and certainly squirrels do so as well, and they will use their own abilities for violence in order to defend those. Right. And so, I mean, it's not exclusive to human beings that this technology. I mean, it's just one of the different ways that nature deals with differences in opinion as to how things should go.
I agree with that. Robert, I think one of the reasons why the socialist anarchists get so upset by the anarcho-capitalists, part of it, I think, is our own fault, in the sense that sometimes we talk about anarcho-capitalism as if we have a plan we want to impose on the world. Like, we know how things should work, so put us in charge, and we'll make it work that way. And I think that's partially our own fault. I mean, I happen to believe that something like a capitalism is what we will see and preserved in a world of voluntary interaction of people in a world without a state. But other people want to have other kinds of things. I mean, that's perfectly wonderful. The main point is to make sure that everything is as non-aggressive as possible. Where was I recently? Corey Massimino, my communist friend. He's actually a Rothbardian anarchist, but he's like a left anarchist. Took me to a funny restaurant. We were somewhere in San Diego, and so he takes me to this vegetarian commune, worker-controlled, sort of co-op that served only vegetables, gruel, and copper pans. I mean, this place is like not where I want to eat. I mean, I'm a McDonald's guy through and through, and so I thought it was just a weird place, and everybody seemed kind of grim, and I thought the food tasted terrible, and and the communist propaganda everywhere, and yet, they weren't hurting each other. They're just kind of doing their weird vegetable co-op thing. I don't get it, but Lord knows they have the right to do it, so that's fine with me. It doesn't offend me. Like, I would never want to stop something like that. I just don't think it's very efficient or very aesthetically appealing. But certainly that sort of cultural expressions of various economic forms of control. And Massimino's defending this stuff. Of course he is. He thinks it's just great. Although I took him back with me to the hotel, he immediately ordered a burrito from the hotel bar. So But anyway, that's another question.
Well, go figure. I mean, obviously, when you have the ability to, I don't know, instead of having sort of consensus based, let's go ahead and work this together and come up with, what we think is the best type of food. You've got too many cooks, and you come up with something that doesn't exactly satisfy everyone. In fact, it doesn't satisfy anyone. Whereas if you have a variety of cooks, throwing out their various different wares and having each person pick their own, selection amongst the different options that are out there, and having the ability to provide some sort of compensation to the people that they're buying it from, it provides the opportunity for people to see, all right, well, this guy knows what he's doing and therefore successful, and he'll expand. And the person on the other side who is not doing a very good job, well, he'll best find some other alternative to, create his trades with other people.
Yeah, maybe it's a good way to think about it. Anarcho-capitalism as a kind of predictive ideology rather than a prescriptive ideology, if you know what I mean.
So one of the things that I often get is with the anarcho-capitalist versus the anarcho-communist is that you lose legitimacy over the claim of ownership of something if you become an absentee owner and other people are using the stuff in order to create new products, new services. And that's where they just, kind of like differentiate between private property and personal property.
Yep.
How does that factor into your understanding as an anarcho-capitalist? They say,
so
I have a legitimate claim.
Yeah, so again, I think that private property rights are a product of a technological innovation that became a social consensus. As part of that, we have developed not the state, but we as a people have developed an institution called titles, right? So we have titles to property, and those are the things that are bought and sold, and that seems to me a far more socially beneficial or peaceful way of going about buying and selling, rather than having some outside dictator going, okay, you've worked enough to earn that property. You haven't worked enough to earn that property. And that seems to me very arbitrary and very scary. To presume that any outsider can look at a work style situation and exogenously impose ownership rights based on labor style outcomes. I think a title theory of property is far more peaceful and non arbitrary. So I completely reject it. I don't see any problem with absentee landlords. On the other hand, if they're doing a crappy job of it, I mean, there's nothing wrong with somebody coming along and buying them out. And I like to think that happens. But my strong impression, Robert, of the socialist anarchists with their labor theory of value is that they believe they know what's right. They think they know how the social order should work, and they want to impose it. And I think that's just kind of ultimately comes down to a rejection of the mysteries and magic and surprises associated with human freedom. So that perspective worries me very much. I don't think it's any accident that the left anarchists have, throughout history, never shown themselves really to be, in the final analysis, consistent friends of freedom. They defended the results of the Bolshevik Revolution up until the last minute, until it just became an absolute massacre. And they were shocked by that. Like Emma Goldman, is a classic case of that. So I'm worried that the left anarchists have too much of a planning mentality. Like they think they know what's valuable. They think they know who should own what's what. And they're ready to see that realized in reality, even if it involves, as they used to say, breaking a lot of eggs to make this omelet.
Okay, well, back to the original thought that you mentioned about how there's kind of like the violence that is the beginnings of what it is to own property and say, well, I'm excluding access to all of this stuff that you might want to do, have access to. Then the question is brought up by Kenshi Henji. He says, if you think that private property is a right, or is it something that has costs that must be met by the owner? In other words, in order to own something, do you have a burden upon yourself in order to protect it? It is your, without doing so, you are no longer, your claims for ownership of it are no longer valid.
Well, so I would say that it depends on the stage of social evolution in which you're in. Certainly initially, if you can't bear the costs of defending your claims, you can't maintain those claims. So, for example, if I arrive as the first person in North America, I can't say, this I own, or I can say that, but it's an unsustainable claim, right? Ultimately, you're not going to be able to defend that claim, and so you lose that claim because you can't defend it. You can't make claims you can't defend in the early stages of social evolution. But as time goes on, and a social consensus develops, we develop cultural norms and established institutions to uphold claims without the individual directly enforcing them. Then I think you've got a different standard of legitimacy there. So let me just clarify here. In asserting this view, I'm really disagreeing with the Anglo-Saxon Lockean tradition. I don't think that mixing your labor with property has really anything to do with ownership. I find that just to be a fairly ridiculous distraction. I don't think it has anything to do with anything, really.
Well, you certainly wouldn't fit into the standard mold for the anarcho-capitalist, homesteading rights, or that there is a right that comes from homesteading, and I think that there's a lot of disagreement on that. That comes from even, let's say, for example, anarcho-communists or anarcho-socialists that would say, well, if you have gone out into an area of land where nobody is making any sort of claim upon it, and you establish a homestead there for your own private personal use, let's say personal property, then they seem to get along with the concept of homesteading as an actual legitimate claim. And then they're probably going to have a significant bulk when it comes to your expression that says, all right, well, I'm going to say dibs instead of having some sort of creative process that says, I have converted this from nature into something new.
Yeah, God. I mean, I just so instinctively resist this claim that converting something to something else causes some new claim to come into existence. I think that is just utter rot.
Well, let me see if I can take my stab at it and explain.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm going to take various different things that are in nature, the things that exist outside of my psyche, mindset, whatever, the thing that makes me me, decider maker. I make decisions. I'm influencing the atomic structures that exist out in the world through these decisions. I'm making changes to them. And you, too, are making decisions and changing what exists in reality, the physical things that are affected by your actions. And then if I, for example, take the atomic structure of an apple and convert it into glucose and sucrose and convert it into skin or hair, for example, it's somewhat innate to understand that as being claimed as ownership, that I have taken this thing that existed and through a process, a biochemical process, converted it into something else, and I have permanent ownership and claim over it until I abandon it. All right, so that would be a very clear example of how the conversion process works.
I don't know what the conversion of one thing to another has anything to do with ownership. I mean, you own it in the first place, you own it in the second place. What you do in between the first and second stage doesn't matter to me. I mean, the classic example that classical liberals have always used to defend this idea of mixing your labor with things is the case of a stone that a person turns into a sculpture, right? So somehow, because you've labored to turn a stone, a big rock, into a sculpture, that brings forth some special kind of ownership rights, creative rights, or something like that over the sculpture. I mean, I think this is a gigantic distraction. If you own the rock, you own the frickin' rock. If you want to bust it and pulverize it into powder, you own the powder. If you turn it into a pretty statue of a naked woman, you own that too. Ownership is ownership, but what happens once you own something doesn't create any special ownership rights. And I think this is extremely important to understand because of this belief that our laboring with our resources confers some special right to our creation is the whole basis of intellectual property law. I think that's the fundamental fallacy behind copyrights, patents, trademarks, and what strikes me as a completely false sense of property.
Okay. So there's a question for you, again from Kenji, and he asks, if someone steals something and the original owner has no means of getting that thing back, whose property is the thing?
The person who stole it.
Well, there's your answer. Okay. Obviously.
So, and you know why I say that? And here's why I say that. This is a very confusing and difficult topic, but the reason I say that is that any other answer presumes some sort of exogenous, external, almost godlike judge to come from the outside and look down on the situation and say, that is wrong. That cannot be allowed. I now have the power to change that. And the truth is that third party doesn't exist. I mean, it just doesn't exist. There's only us. I mean, there's nothing else. There's just us. So we got to figure it out. We got to figure it out on our own. I mean, Locke always presumed that's the problem I have with the whole Lockean theory of property. And there's always this presumption of some kind of external force of nature, a godlike judge. And you know it. He believed in the state, right? And a lot of times, these people who imagine that there's an external exogenous judge who can assess the justice of ownership, that eventually becomes converted into and instantiated within the state. And for Locke, that's what it was. I mean, the state was ultimately the final judge of what was just and unjust claims of law. And I think as anarchists, we can't go there, and I'm not willing to go there. So now when I've talked about this whole idea with other people, they say, well, are you saying that might makes right? And that's not entirely what I'm saying, but what I am saying is that might makes reality. And reality is the most important thing. We have to deal with it.
Yeah, you do. You definitely have, when it comes to reality, it's going to mold everything else as far as philosophy or thought or whatever. You have to work within what the reality that we have there. Obviously, though.
This is a very, very, very interesting topic. I mean,
I agree.
I don't think I've ever talked about this in a live conversation before, but I've thought about it a lot. Right? It's really, really intriguing.
Well, it's certainly going to blow a lot of minds, with the idea that, homesteading is it's not really that big of a deal. Either you own the land or you don't.
And let me just say that I get all of this from, it's the first third of Mises's book called Socialism, all right? This was written in 1920. He comes out of this European continental intellectual tradition that is, that did not derive its social theory from Anglo-Saxon tradition. It's a completely different continental tradition, and particularly Viennese, and he rethinks the whole structure of society from the ground up, and it's like a mind-blowing section. I mean, I think everybody should just go back and read it, because before he demolishes socialism, he has to establish what society is and what property is. So he lays out this really elegant theory that I find just kind of shocking, and it changed my outlook on the whole subject.
Well, I haven't had a chance to read it, so I guess.
Well, don't feel bad. Hardly anybody has. I mean, it's like lost stuff. People just don't bother with reading this. I mean, it's just it's too weird and too bizarre. But it's definitely worth your time to read. Also, Robert, while you're in the course of this, he has a chapter on sexuality and the family and sexuality in particular, and men and women, that is so hair-raising, like you wouldn't even read it on the air. so, so
Okay.
you can look forward to that.
So I guess then, when it comes to, for example, private property, the anarcho-capitalist and the anarcho-communist, at least from your perspective, might actually agree in certain respects that um, obviously, if you're not there, if you're an absentee owner, and the workers just decide that they're going to go ahead and take ownership over this, if you're not able to enforce your claim that this is your property and that you're you're just absent, well then. The workers could make their claim, and then they could consider it legitimate.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
then,
No, I think that's right. I mean, that's a very uncomfortable conclusion for me, but I think it's right. And you know what? I think it has an analogy here. In the early 19th century in America, and of course it's true all over the world, there's widespread ownership claims over slaves, right? Everybody said, well, these people are my property. Slavery is essentially established in law and custom and title and culture as a property right. That's what everybody believed. I mean, the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution was designed to protect the right of people to have secure possession of their slaves. It wasn't about, that was the main point of the Fifth Amendment. Like, we can't take your slaves without compensating you, So what was the force that and obviously we're all against slavery, and we want to see it go away. So how is it possible that these plantation owners could have maintained their rights to their slave property without having the ability to defend that right? In other words, it would be very expensive to be a household plantation owner with 3,000 slaves that want to run away, to keep them corralled and maintain and defend that ownership right. You basically couldn't do it at all unless you had some external, exogenous, outside defense agency returning escaped slaves, helping you in that respect. And that was the role the federal government played. The federal government is the one that maintained those false claims to ownership. Slavery could not have sustained itself without the laws requiring you to return escaped slaves. I mean, it just wouldn't have been sustainable claims. I don't care how much money you paid for the slaves. How much the county courthouse says you own them. None of it matters if you can't maintain your property rights through your own expense. Your claims are unjust and illegitimate and basically unsustainable in reality.
So then I guess what you're kind of saying is that the property norms for society, the expectation that you would have absentee ownership of property that other people are working in, that you would maintain ownership over it, is primarily due to a social consensus, because you have a very large amount of people who obviously are able to put their various monies or guns towards whatever particular efforts that happen to be, and so it's about the societal norm that we're trying to create a norm where we're respecting that each person is bound by the same expectations, instead of having this elite group of people who happen to lord over everyone and to pick the pockets of people willy-nilly because, all right, they're government. And so if we can change the cultural norm to not accept this type of specialty rules for special people, then whether we go into a society where we have an expectation that some capital wealth can be accumulated and so on, is kind of a market of ideas that certainly some people may feel that in their community that no, if that guy has made all of the tools and all the things that are necessary for someone to produce this particular product, even if he leaves them alone on the table or in a factory, and even if he lets other people borrow them, he still has ownership of them. That could be a norm. And another norm that could be is that, well, if you're not actually a participant in the use of these tools and so on, if you move on, then you're abandoning it and returning it to a anybody can claim ownership
Yeah,
state.
yeah, I completely agree with that. I agree with everything you just said. And here's just a really good practical example. Okay, so I work in Atlanta. Let's say that I park my car outside the Fox Theater in Atlanta on the street, parallel parked, and I leave my wallet on the hood because I think that's what I'm going to do. And I go into my office, and I come out at the end of the day, and it's gone. Okay, obviously it's going to be gone, right? And if I go, what the hell? Somebody stole my wallet. This is an outrage. That was my wallet. I, you know, this is not. What's the first thing that anybody in Atlanta is going to say to me? You're an idiot.
Yeah, well, you asked for it.
Yeah, you're an idiot. I mean, you think you're going to maintain your private property rights over your wallet by leaving it on the trunk of your car and going inside your office for the day? That's not going to happen. Okay, but on the other hand, let's say I'm in Queenstown, New Zealand, okay, where I just got back from. I promise you, I could be anywhere in Queenstown, New Zealand, leave my wallet on the trunk of my car, and somebody may pick it up and give me a call from their cell phone and say, I got your wallet, or they'll just not touch it. I could probably have full expectation of property rights over the wallet left on my trunk of my car in Queenstown, New Zealand. So these are two different cultures, two different social settings, a different social consensus, a different regard for what's mine and what's thine. In one place, I have no property rights over my wallet. If under some circumstances, another place I do.
Yeah, and there are examples of this throughout history where, for example, if you were to make a claim over a spot upon a river or some place to dig for gold back during the gold rush, because the number of people that were there that were seeking their riches in gold were fairly low, and we had a kind of tight-knit community where, all right, everybody goes to the same bar, we all know each other. Well, the property norm for protecting your pickaxe and your saddlebags and so on was far more, yeah, you put a tag on this tree over there and everybody respects that that's your area. It didn't require that you put up a wall and fences and all that other stuff in order to protect it. But then if you live in a society where you have a very large amount of potential competing claims over things, in order to secure your property, you're going to have a guard watch over it, or you're going to establish a more significant claim over this particular land, and it's kind of dictated depending upon the supply and demand of people's needs. If they need the access to the land, your property rights claim of saying, I'm going to establish this nature preserve, just by labeling it as the nature preserve of I don't know, Kruger Nature Preserve, which actually I guess exists. Then if somebody in their family and their 100,000 other friends or whatever are starving and they see that there's elephants over there and there's potentially farmable land near the river, tough sell. You're really going to have to change the level of quote-unquote homesteading or the level of protecting that you're going to assert this property claim on.
Yeah, that's right. Your claims to right and wrong, justice and injustice, whether they're true or false, are unrealizable. They can't be acted upon. So in that sense, they're just thoughts in the air. It just doesn't matter. What matters is what's actually obtainable in the real world.
So obviously, we don't accept that the idea that might makes right in a certain respect, because it's not about who has the biggest gun per se, because the quote-unquote pen is mightier than the sword. Well, instead of being the statist saying the pen is mightier than the sword when it comes to passing law and legislation, it's more along the lines of the appeal to the societal norm and
That's right. Yeah, and so I was having this argument with this or discussion with Roderick Long recently, and he asked me the question. He said, "Well, given this view, doesn't this undermine your case against the state? Essentially because the state is actually capable of enforcing its ownership claims over all of us because it has the most guns. So why is that invalid? Why is that claim invalid?" And that's an interesting and potentially deadly criticism of the theory, right? But all I can really say about that is that my biggest case against the state is, first of all, it's a liar. Nothing it says it's doing, it's actually doing. So, everything it does is propaganda. But the
Well, they say
biggest,
they're making roads. They
yeah,
make
this is, they don't make roads. Private sector makes roads. They define where the roads go. And this is where I think, and my Hayekianism comes out. The problem with the state is it presumes to know things that it can't actually know, and this knowledge is enacted with aggressive violence against person and property in a way that circumvents everybody else's wishes and stops the process of social evolution. It stops it, and that's, I think, the biggest crime of the state, that it's like this enemy of progress, an enemy of the gradual evolution and discovery of new information, norms, institutions in the course of social evolution. That, to me, is what's really tremendously evil about the state. I mean, in addition to gulags and gas chambers and internment camps and everything else, the fact that even in its best case, it stops the evolution of history.
Yeah, it certainly does. So Nicholas Cook says that the basic principle of anarchism is the rejection of authority, not the rejection of monopoly on government. And I'm going to have to disagree with him right away, but certainly I'd like your comments on it.
Yeah,
obviously, anarchists don't reject the authority of a person to decide what happens with their body. They don't expect that, well, my personal body, anybody can use it however they want. I'm not going to exert authority over my body. So that's ridiculous. The authority over my children, or the authority over my home, where I'm the person who's put out the labor and effort to obtain this home, so I'm going to claim first dibs when it comes to telling the guests that are at my home, you've got to get out. And then maybe my spouse would say, well, now I have second rights, and I'm going to go ahead and say, you can get out. And then if we have a disagreement, I win. And then similarly, if an uncle or aunt of my children comes by and they are, entertaining the possibility of kicking out some, vagabond who's wandered in, they have the authority there. So I don't know. I think that obviously even any other anarchists accept that there are legitimate authority type claims. So what do you say?
Yeah, I would totally agree with you. I mean, I think we're not against authority. We're against involuntary authority, and we're consistently against the ideology of authoritarianism. Which I see as being basically imposed, exogenously, violently enforced forms of authority. I agree with you. You can't get rid of authority. I don't really even know what that means. I mean, I'm temperamentally really libertarian in the sense that I like rebels just in general. The people who are questioning authority all the time and down with the boss, down with these structures of imposition and regimentation. I agree with that, but a world in which we consistently reject all forms of authority, that sounds to me like a violent and dangerous place, actually.
Yeah. So I think that that's a good way of putting it. I mean, quite frankly, here's the way I think about authority. Okay, we live in a world where there is rivalrous matter, and there are at least two differing opinions as to how that matter will be used. One person will win. You can't have two. Matter only functions with one path of activity. It doesn't exist in two places at the same time, except for in really weird scientific experiments. But as a general rule, if I take this soda can and I put it right here, this is where the soda can is going to be, unless somebody else overrides my authority over it, and then they have the authority over it. And then we have a claim back and forth as to who has legitimate authority over it.
Yeah.
All right. So, okay, cool. So let's go into another I guess debate point that you would often get is one that if we establish an anarcho-capitalist type of society, what we're establishing is essentially feudalism, that the particular homestead owner is going to exert his rights and claims over his particular land, a plot of land, and then he can do what he wants willy-nilly to the poor peasant who happens to pass through his land and so on, or that the various different private companies that are out there are going to establish police forces through their defense organizations and become like RoboCop style rulers of the neighborhoods.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's several parts of the question. So I really resist this idea that we're going to establish anything. I know you didn't mean that literally. What you mean is like this anarcho-capitalism is realized, because I don't think we really want to establish anything, right? I mean, what we want to do is get rid of the state. I really don't care what happens after that. I mean, and if we knew what was going to happen after that, we wouldn't need freedom, essentially. I mean, the whole point of freedom is to discover the kind of world we want. That's the whole point of freedom, not to impose anything. So, but as regards private police protecting property, I think that's yeah. I mean, I'm all for that. Actually, I have no problem with RoboCop style situations, private police forces. I think company towns were in general a good thing in history. They eventually became outmoded, but at the time they were wonderful for people, and there's a reason that the market eventually selected them out. But company towns or whatever, even today, when U.S. companies go to the developing world, and particularly Africa, they'll take over whole towns and basically privatize them, and,
yeah, but like Coca-Cola would do, they would just go ahead and off potential Labor Party leaders.
Yeah, okay, so I'm against murder, but but I have no problem with like full scale corporate privatization of whole developing communities. I don't think it's a problem, and we saw this in Africa recently because Firestone, was dealing with this problem. I'm forgetting where it was, Liberia or somewhere. And they had the problem with this outbreak of this disease, and they beautifully controlled it in a way that was completely different from the rest of the surrounding community, just through private property rights and establishing beautiful hospitals and that sort of thing. So, yeah, in that sense, I'm really a serious defender of capitalists and the capitalism and capitalism as an institution. And also private police and private imposition of potentially coercive force. I think ultimately we're going to have that, or we're going to have the state, and I'd rather have the private cops rather than the state.
Well, I'm going to have to do a little work to soften that blow, because it sounds like exactly the worst nightmare that I could imagine when it comes to the things that I would argue with some of the people that I've discussed things with.
Interesting.
So,
well, no, please do. I'm welcome for our corrective.
Well, the thing that I would say is this: is that in a community and a society, you're going to have a very large number of consumers and purchasers, and the level of disparity in wealth that you're going to see between people certainly will exist. You're going to have your Michael Jordan, who's going to be extremely wealthy basketball player, and then you're going to have your no-name Joe, who happens to play on the Spurs or something like that, and yeah, he's part of the team and he does help, but his wealth is going to be significantly less. And you're going to have the capitalist who's quite successful and the capitalist who isn't as successful. But as a general rule, you're going to reach the maximum type of market forces that will allow a single person able to pursue their own wealth without having government create all these other sort of tricks that manipulate things and have this gigantic disparity. So then now we have a society that's somewhat more egalitarian when it comes to the monies that they have available to them. And that being the case, the providers of services that are used in a very large community have to be defer to what it would be for the the normal Joe type thing. And you're going to find that in a market of competition, since you have the crux of your customers as being the general masses, you're going to find that it's going to probably be nonprofit organizations that run policing and arbitration and that kind of thing. That you won't see that the profit-based organizations will be as relied upon because of the concerns that they have about being corruptible and so on.
Yeah, that
Whereas,
could be true. Yeah, I don't disagree with that analysis. That sounds, but that's a little bit of a market prediction. I think it's a very wise analysis on your part. You look back at like private police forces in the Gilded Age. When these gigantic monopolistic titans of industry would control large swaths of area and huge factories and that sort of thing, and the workers would start to get revolt. There were several terrible incidences that happened, in the 1880s and 1890s where, people were just mowed down. Essentially, workers were mowed down for attempting to occupy the factories, and those kind of historical incidences put us as pro-capitalist anarchists in an uncomfortable situation. Like, is that legitimate or is it not? And the one thing I would observe about that is that it was a catastrophic decision. It turned the public against industry, and it turned it against the capitalist class. So it was very much contrary to their own interest to have pursued those kind of violent methods against labor organizing. And if they had perfect foreknowledge, they certainly would not have pursued those tactics. And of course, these days you could never get away with that, right? Because we've evolved.
certainly, and preferences have changed, and the societal approval for different things are going to change as preferences change.
No, that's not.
So Johnny Schmidt asked me to ask you, is the worker-boss relationship under the currently existing, as it is, capitalism, is that a voluntary arrangement where, you've got to go out and find a job, and, your relationship with an employer and that kind of stuff? Is our current system with that type of, involvement voluntary?
Yeah, so this is a really important question. I don't think it has an easy answer. I think what we have is an artificially truncated range of options that workers have been given since the Second World War, essentially. Through a series of labor mandates, it's been a fascinating thing to see how the boss-worker relationship was cobbled together essentially by the state. So you've got withholding taxes, you've got mandated benefits, you've got health care provision. All these things they seem like benefits to the worker. They're actually holding the workers hostage. And the way the tax structure works heavily subsidizes this kind of W-2 hierarchies, and and certainly so everything is all subsidized in that sense. So I'm not prepared to say it's entirely voluntary. It's like we have volition within a structure that seems on the face of it to be voluntary, and to that extent it's true. It's like you can choose it's like a jail in which you can choose which cell you want to sleep in, essentially. So yeah, you face choice in that sense, but it's not the full range of choice you would have in an atmosphere of human freedom. And that's really all I can say about it. I'm a well-known defender of Walmart, McDonald's, and the entire corporate class, right? And I think on that these are great benefits to society. But exactly what the worker capital relationships would look like in a state of anarchism, I can't say for sure, because that's not the world we live in. Unfortunately, the state kind of monopolized this relationship. I point to World War II as a great example of this, because the tax laws and the labor bureaucracies and the regulatory agencies and everything essentially tried to preserve a kind of statist-run style economic structure after the Second World War, and they created miniature versions of the state within the corporate structures and the United States. I mean, there was no such thing as withholding tax before World War II. I mean, there was no such thing as employer-provided health care or mandated benefits and these kinds of things. This is all, or lifetime employment or retirement and all the rest of this nonsense. None of this stuff existed before World War II, and certainly not before the New Deal. And I would love to have seen how the worker-boss relationship would have evolved over time had it been given the freedom to experiment, which we haven't had yet. So to that extent, I completely agree with the left libertarians. I think they make very powerful and interesting critiques of the existing corporate hierarchical wage boss relationship.
Okay, well, on a different subject, moving on, because I think that fairly clear about exactly our side of things. It's clear that there are interventions and manipulations, and so no, it's not a free choice. It's a very limited choice under the current system. So on a different topic, I've had this question that's been asked by Kenji and by watching the Freedom Fiends having a discussion with someone else, I forget what his name was, where the claim is that this concept of the non-aggression principle is flawed or incomplete. In fact, it fails a variety of different tests that you might put forth to it, but instead that we should be using as a moral standard or moral code, moral understanding is the self-interest principle, that you make decisions based upon one's own self-interest, and then if you have other people that are involved in these decisions, then you work out, well, if I screw over these people, then they're going to come back and harm me, so therefore it's in my self-interest to not do so. And I'm inviting aggression against me if I initiate aggression, and it kind of leads to the non-aggression principle. What do you think about that particular?
I don't know. I have to think. I would have to think about that a little bit. So often when these kind of questions are presented to me, I try to think in the mind of Mises, who's my mentor, really. And I think he would actually probably agree with that. I think he would agree with that. I don't think that Mises accepted the non-aggression principle as the one and only and foundational posit, or postulate that is at the very core of freedom. I don't think he did. He saw it maybe as a sort of an embodiment of a good and socially beneficial rule of thumb that is a good kind of operating mechanism for daily life. But I'm not sure that he saw it as really essentially foundational. So, yeah, I would have to think about that a little bit more. I mean, my problem with the non-aggression principle, as it's usually stated, is that it seems sometimes kind of question-begging. Like, people don't always agree on what aggression is, One of the things I like to do is return to the works of Herbert Spencer, actually. I don't know if you know about Herbert Spencer, but he's the one who first articulated this idea of the law of equal freedom. And I like that. Like, you have freedom so long as everybody else around you has that exact same freedom. So you can't interfere with other people's freedom, which in effect means that you can't steal their stuff or take their lives from them. The law of equal freedom seems like a decent moral structure for society. It's another way of stating the non-aggression principle without presuming knowledge we don't actually have. But I would have to think about that a little bit. I think it's a decent idea.
Well, I don't care for it myself, but Kenji's really interested in it, so whatever.
Yeah. Well, I think all the anarcho-capitalists are kind of a little bit divided. Like, some people are really happy to just kind of rest everything on this idea of human rights, and the people who just kind of like embed the whole of their ideological structures within this idea of natural rights tend to just lean on the non-aggression principle as the central thing, and but other people who are more utilitarian oriented or are focused on consequentialism and that sort of thing, and try to look beyond just assertions of rights, might look to a principle of self-interest as being one worth talking about or thinking about.
Well, I certainly like it in certain respects, but it's just not my kind of thing. I'm more of the equality of rights type perspective. I like that myself. That's actually where I call it the consistency principle. In that whatever is for me is consistent with you, and if I go ahead and violate what it is that you've consistently stated in then we have to have a consistency of application on both sides. So if we accept the anarcho-capitalist type of system, it can work out consistently, and that's perfectly fine. We can both go out into nature and then claim rocks or trees or land and convert it or not convert it or whatever. And as long as I've respected that your claim is valid, you respect my claim is valid, then great. We move forward as a consistency thing.
Yeah, I think that's a good statement of the Herbert principle.
Yeah.
But
But
Herbert Spencer idea. Yeah.
but when I use that, I come up with some people will say, well, then you're when you apply it, which I kind of do in a somewhat crazy way, towards people who break the norms that we expect. When I do that and apply the consistency, they kind of recoil in horror because it's kind of weird. Let's say, for example, that a person goes ahead and violates another person's body, sexual nature, perhaps. For me, the consistency rule is that they have given implicit consent to every single other human being on the planet to violate their body however they see fit, in perpetuity, until they make another agreement with the person that they violated to get a retroactive consent or redress or kind of like I've accepted that what you did is no longer going to bind you to this acceptance. So for consistency's sake, then the rapist is now facing, well, you're going to be a part of our drug trial, or, well, I'm going to test out my new tattoo pattern on you, or I've always wanted to see what it's like to beat the tar out of somebody.
Mm-hmm.
So there's the response that says, well, this is creating an illegitimate amount of punishment for the crime, so to speak, and I just don't see it as being a debt that is created by an actor who violates the other person. I think of it as being a statement of, this is what my norms are. This is the consistency that I accept. And if they realize that they don't like that, they better try to make amends with whoever they violated in that way and create a new consistency, which is we can only have relationships with each other that are consensual. What do you think of that?
Well, I think it's interesting, but the problem with that, I think, is that there's an expectation and embedded in that outlook that everybody should somehow be required to accept that, and there's no way you can sort of guarantee that. If a person could just believe that it's okay, like I might believe that it's fine for me to steal from other people, but it's not fine for them to steal from me, and what's going to stop that? I mean, just because there's a philosophy floating out there about the consistency principle is not going to stop me from, asserting my right to be inconsistent, essentially.
Right. Well, the thing that I would say would happen is essentially, all right, well, you stole stuff from people. Lo and behold, now your image is being distributed as being a person who authorizes that anyone wants to have your stuff, they can come and take it anytime they want. And there would be kind of like the bounty hunters who go around and get your stuff. And some people would say, well, you're not allowed on my property because I know you're going to just take my stuff, so I'm going to stand here with a gun.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is that in a free society there would be an emergent consensus that would come about through long-term trial and error that would sort of look like a principle of a law of equal freedom or a consistency principle or something like that. And that I agree with, because in the end we all want to live in a society where we have maximum freedom and maximum prosperity, and whatever those social structures are that realize that, we're going to embrace them.
Absolutely. And obviously, in the example that I gave, the person isn't realistically going to be hunted down and thrown into drug trials and so on. What likely would happen is that they would do what other anarcho-capitalists have suggested might be the potential type of prison that might exist, which is that they go into a hotel that provides them security and prevents other people from coming out to seek either redress or whatever, and then they plead for absolution, and so they put themselves into a prison, so to speak, and protect themselves and the prison owner or the hotel owner requires a certain level of responsibility from him in order to accept him into the hotel, things like that. So, yeah, but there are certainly all sorts of other opportunities that would be presented, and how does this actually work out? We don't know.
We don't know, and it's one of the great tragedies, I think, of the 20th century that or really of the last 500 years, that we've not been allowed to see how a world of private justice and enforcement and institutions that protect us from crime and bring about restitution. We've not been allowed to see what this would look like because the state has so thoroughly monopolized this realm through its jails and its courts and its state regulations and laws. It's really terrible. I don't think it's an accident that the biggest question that people ask about anarchism is like, well, what are you going to do about law, courts, and jails? Well, the reason people ask that question is that those realms have been so thoroughly monopolized by the state. We've been denied access to the kind of knowledge that we would have because it's been totally controlled. In a world of freedom, we would have had innovative, creative solutions that we could actually point to and understand. But in our current world, we can't understand it because we've not had the freedom to develop and innovate.
Right. We have these bread lines, and without these bread lines, how in the world would we get food? So
that's a great line. I'm gonna have to use that. Yeah, that's really it. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I would never have predicted exactly how groceries would work and how you'd have distributors and brokers that would handle candy. What the hell is that? Oh my goodness.
Yeah, that's really a great way to put it. I wished I had that line when I was just recently at a high school in Oregon, and at a private boarding school, and I was speaking about anarchism to the entire student body, if you can imagine this. Mm-hmm. And I got a lot of questions along those lines, and I would have loved to have said basically what you just said right now. I think that's very persuasive and very compelling.
Well, I do want to again thank you for joining me on the show on the Anarchist Experience. Apologize about the short notice there, but
no, I'm really glad you thought of me and gave me a ping. And I just happened to be sitting here working, and it's really been fun to visit with you, Robert. I really enjoyed it a lot. And I like to talk like this because it helps me think through things. It's always beneficial.
Well, it's my pleasure. And anytime that you want to discuss, some thoughts that you're working on, I'll be, open to having a conversation anytime.
Great. We'll ask again.
Well, absolutely. And so if you are watching and you don't know where to find Jeffrey Tucker, please visit liberty.me. His specific channel is tucker.liberty.me. Is that correct?
That's right. You can get all my writings there. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again for joining us here at the Anarchist Experience. My name is Robert, and I'm your host. Have a great weekend.
My pleasure, Robert. Bye-bye.